My presentation today aims to examine the extent to which the new right to data portability, recently introduced in the General Data Protection Regulation, has an impact on the dynamics of information control, with a particular reference to two intertwined discourses relating to data protection and information privacy. This is the outline of my presentation. Probably I don't have much time to go through it. I just keep it there a few seconds and to save some time. So, the literature relating to this new right is currently very rare, and most articles criticize this right from a competition law perspective. So the common critique relates to the fact that perhaps there's no proper legal base in the data protection framework for this right, and that the dominance in the market is not properly taken into consideration. Some responses have been given from the privacy advocates by simply referring to an enhanced right to informational self-determination. However, I take this approach insufficient to dismiss the external criticism and attempt to put this right in concrete context and provide it with a detailed analysis of its privacy implications. So according to the GDPR, the right to data portability roughly consists of two components. The first is the right to obtain a copy of personal data. The second is to transmit those data from one processing system to another. So also in the GDPR, there are two explicit objectives in relation to this new right. The first is to enhance the individual access, and the second is to strengthen the control of individuals over their personal data. So the first component, the right to obtain a copy of data, in my view, seems remotely relevant to the data portability or data control, but more close to the existing right of access. If we look at the European Commission's proposal or the amendment by the European Parliament, we will find out that this right to obtain a copy can be considered as a natural extension of the right of access. The second component, the right to transmit personal data, is a real rule of data portability. With the introduction of this right into the GDPR, we could observe a sea change invited in the control dynamic that involves various players. First, individuals, once largely marginalized from the efforts to protect personal data, are entitled now to have a final say on certain data flows. Second, the data controllers are not allowed to interfere with the data subjects in terms of directing data flows. And there could be a new industry, what we call the intermediaries or the fourth parties, who specialize in managing personal data on behalf and for the benefits of individuals. So, moving from the context of data protection to that of privacy, there are mainly two main strands of privacy theories based on the access control dichotomy, which provides a very useful analytic framework for this paper. So the first approach takes an external view and focuses on the access of the others to one's private information. And the second approach favors an internal view and had its core on one individual's ability to control over the degree of information disclosure. The access restraining approach is considered more precise and conceptually better developed because it invites various players to co-determine the information flow. Whereas the individual control approach is particularly useful considering the imbalance of information power between individuals and businesses in the age of big data. So this right to data portability will be examined in both contexts. And first, in the context of access restraining, the two components will be discussed separately. To the first question, does the right to obtain a copy of data help to protect privacy? I'm inclined to give a positive answer, and the reason lies in the difference in ways to protect traditional privacy and informational privacy. Alan Westing, the famous privacy theorist, refers privacy as a personal adjustment process in which he balances the desire for privacy with the desire for disclosure. However, this process has been greatly distorted by the technological changes prompted by internet, social media, and even big data, which dictates greater openness and maximum disclosure. And the second reason relates to the digitalization of private information, which gives rise to a fundamental shift of default in the private sphere, which is the private information is no longer under one's control and flee out of his or her protection realm. Sadly, we have no other options but to trust third parties to process our personal data in an ethical way. So the right to data portability here is helpful because it equips individuals with the vision and the ability to engage in the protection of informational privacy. In terms of the second question in relation to the right to transmit personal data, the quick answer would be no, because this right is by nature access facilitating rather than access restraining. However, the dynamics here could be far more complicated than that. So generally speaking, this right is devised to protect privacy by putting an end to the trust relationship with discredited data controllers. So this right provides a second best approach to first allow individuals to get a copy of personal data and then letting the original copy of data die away without providing constant updates. And I call this a process of data invalidation, which is quite helpful and practical to protect our informational privacy. Privacy risk remains, however, considering the fact that the original copy is still undergoing processing. And in this regard, I suggest a holistic approach and considering the possibility that another right in the GDPR newly introduced, namely the right to be forgotten, can be jointly exercised and together with the right to data portability. It is out of the ambit of my paper to discuss right to be forgotten thoroughly, but here I only intend to point out the potential connection between these new two control-based rights. The right to data portability will be also put in the context of information control. In this context, the protection of privacy refers to the ability to control over knowledge about oneself, which takes the form of information rather than data. So naturally, a more fundamental question needs to be answered in the first place. What is exactly required under individual's control? It has to be pointed out that the control over personal data that RDP enables is not necessarily the same thing with the control over information to protect our information privacy. And here, I take the address of IALS as an example to show that a group of meaningless data needs to be contextualized in order to convey meaningful information. Accordingly, it is true that the RDP provides a higher level of control over personal data, but it not necessarily reached the conclusion that the level of control over information increased concurrently. And my conclusion is quite the opposite. To recap, this presentation investigates into the two components of the right to data portability, put them in the context of two major privacy theories, and points out the unclear difference between the information control and data control. And there are two main points I'd like to make in the conclusion part. The first relates to the inability to exercise control over the original copy, which is still undergoing processing, rendering our private information still out of control. And the second is about the one-sided nature, that the right to data portability only facilitates further spread of one's private information, but can hardly do the other way around to restrict the information flows to a certain degree. In other words, this right only allows for partial control over information outflow, but not inflows at all. So, it is the take-home message of this presentation that this right to data portability engenders mixed results on the protection of informational privacy. It indeed enhances the control over data, but could only make a very limited contribution to the information control, and therefore does not help much to protect informational privacy. That comes to the end of my presentation. Thank you.